A Stranger at Home. Chapter 2. I woke long before everyone else. At the school, the nuns got everyone out of bed at 5 o'clock, winter and summer, to do the endless chores they required of us. We mopped floors, we scrubbed walls, we emptied the buckets of waste from the latrine, we hauled cords of firewood and stacked them into mountains. I crawled out from under my parents' bed and sat at the kitchen table. What was I to do with myself while everyone else slept? It seemed odd to wake to silence. No screaming nuns, no groaning girls, only the quiet breaths of my sleeping family and the growl of my stomach. Hunger was nothing new to me, but all I had eaten since breakfast the day before was a small sample of my mother's food. I had to eat something. There was also a chill in the tent, so I prepared the cook fire, thinking about what I might be able to make that I could stomach. I knew my parents would have the ingredients for bannock. I had watched them both make it many times. I remembered loving bannock, warm and fresh from the oven and covered with lard. It was just another type of bread, and bread was the only thing I truly liked eating at the school. I was sure I could figure out how to mix it. I got a bowl out of one of the chests where we kept our things and set it on the table. Then I rummaged through the supplies until I found a canister of flour. I dumped some into the bowl and added a heap of baking soda. Next, I poured in a cup of salt and a couple of tablespoons of sugar. I stirred in a little water and some fat and started kneading the dough. I wanted to be certain that it was mixed well, so I kneaded for a long time. When I was done, I pressed the heavy dough flat into a pan, opened the cast iron door of the cook stove, and slid it into the cooking chamber. I knew it would take a while to bake, but I kept looking in the cook stove anyways. Nothing seemed to be happening. I took out a book of children's Bible stories and sat at the table to read just one page while I waited. "What is burning?" my father said, raising himself on one arm. I slammed the book shut and jumped to my feet. How much time had passed? I couldn't be sure. I hadn't meant to get so carried away, but one page had led to another and another. Now my breakfast was burning. I leapt to grab it out of the stove, but I burned the tip of my finger and had to pull my hand back. I had forgotten to use a rag to grasp the handle. "What on earth are you doing?" my father asked me. "I'm making bannock," I told him. He crawled out of bed and pulled on his parka. "Well, let's see," he said. He pulled the pan from the stove with a thick piece of cloth and lifted out the blackened disc. He tried sinking his teeth into it without much luck. A smile crossed his face. "Oleman, that isn't bannock. It's banbrick." "How long did you knead it?" "I worked the dough for a really long time so it would be mixed well," I said. "Ah, that pushes all the air out." He tilted his head. "What did you put in it?" I pointed to the ingredients, which still sat on the table. He picked up the baking soda and started to laugh. "Baking soda? That will be why it tastes so bad. You're supposed to use baking powder." He held out the bannock, examining it and clucking his tongue against the roof of his mouth to lose the taste. "How much salt did you use?" "This much," I said, showing him with my hands and trying to hold back the tears. My father walked to the door of the tent and I followed him. I watched as he tossed the bannock out the door. It bounced on the ground and landed at the feet of one of his sled dogs. The dog took one sniff, whimpered, and ran away from it. I wanted to laugh, but a tear fell down my face. My father brushed it away with his thumb. "Come," he said, "I'll make you breakfast." My father made the best sourdough pancakes in the world. I wanted to ask that we pray before we ate, but I was so happy to be sharing that moment with him. I had not forgotten what the nuns told me, though. It was my responsibility to save the souls of my family from hell. I promised myself to bring it up as soon as the time seemed right. My mother was angry when she woke. Supplies were expensive, and she complained about the flour and salt I had wasted. She was hungry, my father said. He looked at me. "And it won't happen again, will it?" he added in English. I shook my head. My mother relented, and she and my siblings joined us at the table. After we finished the pancakes, my father told us to get ready. The supply barge, which came only twice a year, once in the spring and once in late summer, was expected today. With supplies from the barge, the Carpenters, the Wolkes, and the rest of our friends would be leaving for Banks Island. It hit me as though someone had just splashed cold Arctic seawater in my face. We really weren't going home. "Cheer up," my father told me. At least here in Tuck you'll be close to Agnes. You can play with her whenever you choose. Agnes and I had known each other all our lives, but when her mother started to get sick, they had left Banks Island and moved to Tuck. I met up with Agnes again at the school, where she was my best friend. The thought of seeing her every day cheered me a little. I put on my new parka, pulled some beautiful kamek onto my feet. They had also belonged to my mother. Kamek are the mukluk boots worn by the Inuit peoples. And I trailed after my family out of the tent. I studied the wooden square buildings as we walked down the bare dirt main street of Tuktoyaktuk. Some canvas tents lined the street, as on Banks Island, but quickly they gave way to log cabins and other wooden buildings. Despite my happiness at home with my family, I still felt that I needed to get away from buildings and places where so many people lived so close together. This was still the outsider's world. I didn't want to be here. I wanted to be boarding the North Star and setting out across the Arctic Ocean to Banks Island, to where I was raised. By the time we reached the shore, my feet were sore from the soft-soled kamek, and our friends had already packed their tents and possessions onto their schooners, which were lined up along the shore. I had to look away. The scene was more than I could bear. In the distance, the massive barge appeared, a stern wheeler pushing it down the river and across the bay toward the bank. I wanted to cheer like everyone else, but I didn't. Aboard the barge would be drums of fuel, fresh fruit, new dresses from Eaton's, hunting rifles, mail, and even secret government crates. When the barge docked, everyone would rush toward it, eager to see the goodies aboard. Among the crowd milling around on the riverbank were women waiting for new cooking pots and boys waiting for their first rifle. The anticipation was high. The arrival of the supply barge was like Christmas in the north, but this time, for me, its coming was bittersweet. Once the supplies were loaded, the schooners would leave for Banks Island without us. My mother and father talked with other adults to pass the time. I saw Agnes through the crowd, holding on to her mother's arm. I fought my way onto her side and smiled at her. There was so much I wanted to talk to her about. "Hello," I said, my smile turning to a grin. "Don't you wish you were leaving on those boats too?" She turned away from her mother and smiled back at me, but just as she opened her mouth, her mother yanked on her arm and hissed into her ear. I could hear the words, and they were simple enough that I understood. "No English," Agnes's mother said. The smile vanished from Agnes's face. She turned away from her mother as if she would stand her ground, as if she would speak to me even though her mother had forbidden it. But sick though her mother was, she seemed to be pretty strong. She yanked her daughter away in the crowd, and I struggled not to weep. After a moment, I walked away from the crowd and sat on a rock, watching from afar. My sisters and their playmates amused themselves in their homemade dolls, but no one said anything to me. Perhaps I had been gone for so long they no longer knew who I was. I waited for the children I had once played with to remember me. They didn't. They had all grown in the past 2 years, but they still looked the same. Everything about me must have seemed so different to them. I had spent some time that morning gazing into Mother's one small mirror, taking in my short hair and hollow cheeks, my lean body and my hardened eyes. I was different. As she turned to board the schooner, one of the women ruffled my brother's hair with her hand. The way that everyone touched and the kind manner in which they spoke to each other, expressing sorrow at saying goodbye and happiness for years of shared memories, overwhelmed me and filled me with yearning all at the same time. As I watched, the barge and its paddle wheeler came to a standstill against the shore, and the captain appeared on deck. I expected everyone to surge forward and eagerly start unpacking the barge, but as I turned my attention from the boat to the crowd, I saw that the majority of the people were now looking back toward the mainland. I had to squeeze between a few people to get a look, and I could not have anticipated the sight that met my eyes. Making his way toward the Hudson's Bay store was a dark man who moved like a grizzly on its hind feet. His hair sprang from his head in tight, kinky spirals like a strange dark moss. unlike that of the black men I had seen in books, who wore their hair very short. He also had bundles of pelts slung over his shoulder and tied around his waist by a belt. I had heard the elders talk in hushed tones about this man, but to me he had always been an abstract idea, like a spirit. To see him now was shocking. My chest tightened. As he neared, the crowd took a step backward toward the shore. I felt them collectively holding their breath. But the man just continued on to the store. My mother pulled me back to the rear of the crowd. "Dubalak," she whispered to me and my siblings. "The devil." A mosquito-like buzz arose from the men in the crowd as they turned back to begin unloading the barge. I couldn't wait to see what was on board. I looked around for the dark stranger who had just shown up, but he could no longer be seen. When my mother also noticed that he was gone, she took my sisters tightly by the hand and led us back to our tent, not allowing us to stay and help with the unloading. Elizabeth strained to catch sight of the dark stranger as my mother cut a wide berth around the store. I was curious too, though much less so than she was. He was quite a spectacle, his massive frame towering over the heads of the people in the crowd. But I just wanted him to go away. His arrival had cheated me out of the one day a year that was bigger than Christmas, and out of saying goodbye to our friends. Everyone expected that once the dark stranger my mother had called the Dubalak had sold his pelts and collected his supplies, he would go away to wherever it was that he came from. Until then, I had to stay close to home. I was not even allowed to go find Agnes. I couldn't believe how unreasonable my mother was being. Agnes was my best friend in all the world, my only friend. I longed to talk with someone who would not look at me with disappointment every time I stumbled to find the Inuvialuktun word I needed, or each time confusion overtook me because I could not understand what was being said. I wanted to ask Agnes if she could eat the food of our people. I wanted to know what she thought of the giant. Instead, I was stuck with my little sisters pestering me while I tried to lose myself in a book, trying to forget that we were not aboard the North Star on our way home.